Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. On an ordinary October night in 2009, in the quiet South Bay community of Lomita, California, a small neighborhood cafe closed its doors after a routine shift. Staff reconciled receipts, wiped down counters, and turned off the lights. By all accounts, nothing unusual stood out in those final minutes. Yet the next morning, one of the cafe's most consistent presences, 39-year-old hostess Dawn Viennes, was gone. There was no 911 call. No one reported an argument, no one saw her pack a bag, and no one witnessed her walk away. What came next was silence, the kind of silence investigators read as evidence in itself. Her phone stopped generating signals, her financial accounts froze in place, and her predictable work obligations went unmet. A payroll line remained blank, a paycheck was never picked up, and the social ties that marked her routine were abruptly cut. For detectives, this is where a missing person file changes shape. In the U.S., an adult disappearance begins with the presumption that the individual may have left voluntarily. That's why the first step is procedural. Establish the baseline and check the grids. Where was the subject last reliably seen? Who first noticed she was gone? Which records, digital or physical, confirm the absence? Dawn's family and friends pushed for answers when she missed calls and appointments without explanation. That reporting triggered the next level of checks. Her phone records told a simple story. Activity stopped cold after that night. Her bank showed no withdrawals, no credit charges, no hint of travel. There were no plane tickets, bus stubs, or hotel reservations. Prescriptions remained unfilled. Even her DMV and government records showed nothing new. A living adult leaving by choice usually leaves a trace. Dawn left none. Detectives then moved outward from the cafe. They spoke with staff and patrons about the last hours she was seen. They gathered receipts, matched them with closing times, and walked the block to ask neighboring businesses about exterior surveillance. They noted the absence of panic, the lack of any scene that pointed to a struggle, and documented it carefully. The cafe was the last confirmed location, but not a confirmed crime scene. That distinction mattered, and would matter even more later. The key forensic fact in these opening days was not something found, but something not found. It was the complete cessation of digital and financial life after October 18, 2009. For trained investigators, that silence is a discovery. It narrows the window of opportunity, provides a factual cutoff for warrants, and later serves as the first piece of evidence for a jury. You cannot build a case on speculation, but you can build one on the sudden and total stop of a routine. Communities feel these absences in ways the record only later confirms. Regulars at the cafe asked why Dawn wasn't at her post. Family pressed for explanations they didn't receive. In small towns, crimes don't just violate the law, they disrupt the rhythm of daily life. That rhythm had been broken. By the end of the first phase, investigators concluded that voluntary departure was unlikely. The data supported escalation to a probable foul play posture. No body had been recovered, no scene confirmed. But the absence of activity across every measurable channel gave detectives a direction. Keep building as if a crime had occurred, because the probabilities now favored it. In the Dawn Viennes file doesn't deliver drama. It delivers a timetable, a locked cafe, a dark phone, a blank paycheck. From here, the question was no longer just where she went. It was what happened when the silence began. The opening file told us what stopped: a phone, a paycheck, a routine. This phase asks a narrower question. What exactly happened inside and immediately around the cafe the last night Dawn Viennes was reliably seen in Lomita, California, in October 2009? The objective is not to dramatize. It is to build a timed sequence that can survive a courtroom. That means pinning down the last transactions, the lockup routine, who was in the building, who left when, and what the neighborhood's technology saw or failed to see before tapes overwrote and memories blurred. Reconstruction begins with instruments that do not guess. The point-of-sale terminal records the cadence of a shift, orders closed, tips adjusted, credit cards batched. Investigators pull a full export for the last 2 hours of service and compare it to the printed Z report that reconciled the night. The numbers tell a clean story. Final orders close in a tight cluster, gratuities are entered, the settlement batch pushes, and the device goes quiet. That electronic silence matters because it gives a hard-time mark for the end of commerce. When staff statements later describe "about when we finished," the register narrows "about" into minutes. Lockup is next. Small restaurants have muscle memory at closing. Wipe stations, count the drawer, bag the deposit, roll trash, check back doors, shut off the line, kill the lights. Detectives map those steps against who was assigned to them that night and when each step likely occurred. Where a key box or coded alarm exists, they request the panel's event log to see when an arm or disarm was entered and by which credential, if the system retained those data, and if the cafe actually used it consistently. In many mom-and-pop operations, alarms are inconsistent and logs are sparse. The absence of a panel entry isn't proof of anything by itself, but the team notes it because defense attorneys later look for gaps. The staff interviews in this phase are focused, recorded, and cross-checked to the minute. Who saw Dawn last? In what part of the floor? What was she doing? Closing the host stand, wiping a menu stack, reconciling the tip ledger. Did anyone see her step outside, and if so, for how long? The answers produce a cluster rather than a single dot, and the job is to collapse that cluster without inventing precision the evidence cannot support. Each recollection is weighed against the POS timestamps and any camera hits that survive. Surrounding businesses become crucial because they often run exterior cameras that face the street or a shared parking lot. Investigators canvass the block and ask for overnight footage. This is a race. Most systems overwrite in days, some in hours. By the time a missing person case clears, she might come back. Valuable files can be gone. In several storefronts near the cafe, managers report cameras that cycle quickly. Elsewhere, a drive holds a rolling week. Requests go out. Where footage exists, it is pulled and reviewed frame by frame for the final hour of operation and the hour after. The focus is simple. Does any camera clearly capture Dawn, leaving on foot or entering a vehicle? Do we see staff locking up and dispersing in a pattern that matches interview statements? When you cannot prove an assault, you still document exits. The parking lot and alley matter because they are the only ways out that don't require walking a well-lit frontage. If the lot has poor coverage, that gap is documented openly. If a neighbor's angled camera occasionally grabs the far curb, that's noted too, even if the image quality is poor. Investigators also ask the city whether any municipal lens covers the corner or whether traffic cams might have swept the intersection close to closing time. The search is not theatrical, it is patient and exact. You can't invent what a lens didn't see. Trash handling is recorded early, not because there is evidence of a struggle, there isn't in the public record, but because it signs the night's end. Who rolled the bin to the enclosure? What time does the hauler pick up on that route? Can the hauler confirm the collection time for that specific morning? These details firm up the last reliable minutes inside the property without labeling it a crime scene. Search does not equal crime scene is more than caution. It is a rule we will keep following. In this chapter, the cafe remains a last known location with no confirmed forensic assault markers. The door becomes a character only because it is a fact. A front door that closes at a documented time, a side door that a staffer swears was secured, an alley gate that someone says they checked. That information, matched to lighting patterns caught on cameras, helps investigators define a window of opportunity that is measured and defensible. By the end of the canvas, that window is tight. We are not guessing at dawn or midday. We have the span between the final register activity and the last staff departure, bounded by whatever exterior camera hits exist. Inside that span, either Dawn left on her own and immediately abandoned her digital and financial life, or something stopped her from continuing it. The first scenario becomes harder to argue when the next chapter's analysis is added. For now, the work is to fix the window, not to explain it. It is common in cases like this for rumors to surface. Someone claims they heard a raised voice, someone else remembers a hurried goodbye. The record treats those statements with the same discipline as any other claim. They are documented, their sources are evaluated, and they are tested against timestamps. When a detail does not connect cleanly to a recorded time, it is saved, not sold. This is how you keep a file from turning into word soup. You return to the instruments and let them narrow the story. There is a human dimension to this, even in a tone built for court. Staff who work the shift carry real worry. If they missed a sign, if they said the wrong thing, if they locked a door after someone who never came home. The community's question is not abstract. It is the same question investigators must answer. Where is Dawn? The difference is that the file is not allowed to exceed its facts. In towns like Lomita, crimes don't just break laws, they interrupt the simple rhythm of people showing up where they always show up. The story is not told to punish uncertainty. It is told to show what responsible certainty looks like. One detail from the reconstruction deserves emphasis because it becomes the chapter's forensic discovery. The combination of POS closure, verified staff departures, and any exterior captures creates a bounded last-seen interval that is both narrow and independently corroborated. That interval, neither vague nor theatrical, is the window in which Dawn's known life ends in the record. Everything that follows is designed to test that window from both directions. We will not stretch it to fit a narrative. We will use it to challenge every claim that tries to live outside of it. As we move forward, a line I mentioned before stays relevant. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. A closing routine that reads like a training manual, a register that finishes on time, a door that locks when it should. If anything unusual happened, it happened inside a slice of time so narrow it leaves almost no room for improvisation. That forces the investigation to escalate, not in volume, but in precision. The ethical piece is short but necessary. Stories like this are not about turning a workplace into a stage. They are about telling the truth without inflating what cannot be proven. A neighborhood cafe is not a set. It is a place where people work, close the books, and go home. When someone doesn't go home, the focus is not blame by proximity. It is accountability earned through evidence. If you've ever worked a closing shift, you know the checklist. That checklist, mundane and repetitive, becomes the skeleton of the case. We have not identified a perpetrator, suggested a weapon, or created a crime scene where one has not been confirmed. We have done something both smaller and more important. We have established a defensible last known window anchored by records and reviewed against what cameras survived. When prosecutors later speak of a timeline, they will be speaking about this work. By the time investigators had locked down the cafe's closing routine and narrowed the window of when Dawn Viennes was last seen, the case needed a sharper question. Did she leave on her own or had something else occurred? In California, a missing adult can always be written off as voluntary, but procedure requires that possibility to be tested with evidence, not assumption. Detectives move through the decision tree that separates a runaway from a victim. They started with her phone. Activity stopped completely after October 18, 2009. No calls, no texts, no new handset, no tower hits beyond Lomita. The financial review followed. Her bank accounts went silent. No cash withdrawals, no credit card use, no paycheck collected. Prescriptions were checked. No refills, no transfers, no signs of ongoing care. Transportation and travel records showed nothing either. No airline ticket, no bus stub, no Amtrak booking, no rental car. Her vehicle stayed put. Each negative by itself might have been dismissed. Together they formed a pattern investigators knew too well. A sudden, total stop in every ordinary channel of life. That evidence allowed the case to escalate from missing person to likely homicide. It wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. For Dawn's family, this confirmation wasn't a surprise. It matched what they already feared. For law enforcement, it justified the next phase. Search warrants, targeted re-interviews, and eventually, the pursuit of evidence that could stand in court. The silence of her digital and financial trail was not just absence, it was proof that she hadn't chosen to walk away, and so the file shifted, permanently. This was no longer a question of whether Dawn might come home. It was a question of who knew what happened inside that narrow window and why she never emerged from it. If someone close to you simply vanished, which would convince you fastest that something was wrong, the phone going dead, the money freezing, or the failure to show up where they were expected? By the time the timeline at the cafe was locked and the decision matrix had stripped away the voluntary departure theory, the case needed movement from outside the paperwork. It came on February 23, 2011. Detectives arranged to recontact a central figure, someone already interviewed, someone whose account would have to square with a life that had stopped moving in every measurable way. The meeting did not go as planned. The vehicle fled south toward Rancho Palos Verdes. Units followed at a controlled distance along the coastal roads that wrap the cliffs. The car stopped. The driver ran. Seconds later, he went over the edge. First responders in Los Angeles County trained for scenes like this. Cliff, ocean air, unstable ground. Deputies secured the rim, fire rescue set anchors, medics descended. The fall distance was significant, roughly the height that turns a jump into a survival question. He lived. The ambulance transported him under watch to a local trauma center. That single act turned a slow, document-driven file into a live custodial situation, no longer a series of abstractions about a missing hostess in Lomita, but a person in a hospital bed whom investigators needed to question lawfully. Hospital interviews are not routine conversation. They are governed by criminal procedure and medical realities. Before any substantive questioning, detectives documented condition, obtained medical clearance for contact, and advised rights. If the subject could not meaningfully waive, no interview would go forward. If he could, recording starts, identities are stated on tape, the time is noted, and questions are precise. Last confirmed contact with Dawn Viens, movements in the narrow cafe window, and any explanation for the absolute silence in her phone, bank, and medical life after October 2009. When statements are taken in a hospital, chain of custody begins at the bedside. Audio files are logged, duplicated, sealed, and booked. Every person in the room is listed. Every hand that touches the evidence is recorded. The goal is simple. If anything said here matters later, a jury won't be asked to take it on faith. Even before a word is captured, the event itself has evidentiary weight. Prosecutors call it post-event conduct, behavior after a critical incident that can suggest consciousness of guilt. Defense lawyers call it panic, shock, or a mental health crisis unrelated to criminal liability. The law doesn't prejudge the jump. It allows a jury to consider it alongside everything else. That is why the paperwork is so strict. If there will one day be a trial, the record must show that any statement was voluntary, that no promises were made, that medication levels were considered, and that the subject either requested counsel or did not. Hospital interviews produce pages of documentation because later litigation tends to start there. While the subject recovered, deputies held a security watch consistent with policy for high-risk detainees in medical care. Contact logs recorded who entered the room and when. Detectives built a parallel chronology for the day of the Cliff event. Vehicle departure points, call-outs on the radio, distances covered, how long between the stop and the jump, whether any verbal exchange occurred that needed to be memorialized. The facts are sober and ordered. They are supposed to be. Cases that hold do not rely on color. They rely on sequence. For the family, news of the cliff reached them differently than it reaches investigators. In their minds, it was not post-event conduct. It was a human shock that landed on top of 16 months without their person. In cases like this, the ethical line is to acknowledge that gap and stay on the record. What the law needs is not the family's reaction or the public's conclusion. It is a set of procedures that will stand when each party tells a competing story about why a man went off a cliff and what, if anything, that means. From the investigator's perspective, the significance of February 23rd was not only the act, but the procedural doorway it opened. With the decision matrix complete and the last seen window tight, the cliff event provided grounds to escalate. Preservation orders on relevant devices and accounts, fresh warrants for premises and vehicles already identified in earlier interviews, and tightly focused re-interviews to capture statements that might now shift. The watchword remained the same: no body recovered and no confirmed crime scene. The cafe, which would soon be searched destructively, was still a last known location, not a proven site of violence. Staying disciplined about that distinction guarded the case against the exact attack that sinks nobody prosecutions: overreach. One of the quiet realities of major cases is how often they hinge on logistics. In the hours after the fall, detectives coordinated with hospital counsel about access and with the district attorney's office about the timing of any formal arrest decision once the subject was medically cleared. If no arrest would be made that day, the watch continued. If probable cause hardened, paperwork moved. These aren't television beats. They are the reason a file stays admissible. There is also a community truth worth stating in one sentence. In towns like Lomita and the coastal neighborhoods nearby, events on a cliff or a pier echo. People talk, rumor builds, and the risk is that the rumor becomes the narrative. The corrective is simple: release only what the record can support. The community deserves information, the victim deserves accuracy. The day ended with more paper than anyone wanted and a new reality for the case. A central figure had taken a leap that almost ended his life. He survived. Detectives had a custodial path to ask the questions that had been waiting since October 2009. The investigation was no longer grinding forward on ledgers and absence alone. It had crossed a threshold that allowed it to ask harder questions under recorded conditions. The line "I keep to 1 per" still applies. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. On February 23rd, the case added something that wasn't data. It added an act. What that act meant would be argued later in front of 12 people. Before that could happen, the search teams still had their work to do. After the Cliffside event forced the case out of neutral, detectives moved from interviews and matrices to work that leaves marks on a building. March 2011 began with warrants, narrow in scope, supported by the tight last seen window you've already heard, and signed to authorize a destructive search at the cafe in Lomita where Don Vian's was last reliably placed. This was not a declaration that the restaurant was a crime scene. It was a recognition that if physical evidence existed anywhere tied to that final window, the most logical structure to test was the one where the night ended. Search teams arrived early, split responsibilities, and documented every step on video. Interior photographs were taken before a single tile was moved. Surfaces were swabbed for baseline comparison. Plumbing access points were mapped. The grease management system, common to commercial kitchens, was identified along with any waste interceptors, cleanouts, and disposal routes. The plan was simple. Follow every pathway where trace material could realistically travel and sit. The patio and floor came first. Concrete doesn't volunteer secrets. You have to ask hard. Investigators marked cut lines around drain lines and high-traffic work paths, then brought in rotary hammers to open controlled sections of slab. Dust management was in place to protect both personnel and evidence integrity. As pieces came up, the voids were inspected under direct light and with portable scopes. Debris was bagged, labeled, and assigned to a chain of custody officer who never left the room. It reads mechanical because it has to. The only way a jury trusts a negative is if you show that you looked where evidence would reasonably be and looked the right way. Cadaver dogs were deployed once the area was secured. Handlers gave them time to acclimate and then worked a grid that included the kitchen line, storage, and exterior abutments. Alerts were logged and cross-checked with environmental confounders, cleaning agents, food waste, and old spills that can cause false interest. The dogs aren't final answers, they are directional tools. Their passes did not produce a target zone that justified tearing up the entire footprint, and that fact was recorded with the same discipline as a hit would have been. Waste systems got particular attention because they can be overlooked in cases with no body. Investigators traced the grease trap from inlet to outlet, documented service records and pickup schedules, and examined accessible segments for trapped dense matter. Where a line could be opened without destroying the facility, it was opened. Where it couldn't, borescope cameras were used. Trap contents were sampled. Bagged waste from the period nearest Dawn's disappearance had long since been collected and destroyed according to routine hauling schedules. That reality was anticipated, noted, and folded into the report. In a court file, acknowledging what you can no longer reach is as important as celebrating what you find. It proves you are not selling a certainty you can't back up. The search extended to the substructure where it existed: crawl spaces, utility chases, voids at wall bases, anywhere dust layers might hold anomalies. Ultraviolet survey was used selectively, not as a magic wand, but as a screening aid for residues worth swabbing. Those swabs still need a lab, and labs need known comparators to mean anything. Without a recovered body, these samples were logged for potential comparison against known reference profiles if the case ever produced them. By late day, the floor showed scars, the patio held cut lines, and the building had been treated with care that looks rough to a layperson and careful to a forensic auditor. The headline was not dramatic. No human remains were recovered. That sentence, placed correctly, is not a failure. It is a fact that narrows the argument space. If the prosecution would one day say the cafe played any role in what happened, that claim would have to live without the kind of body-based confirmation jurors see on television. If the defense would argue that the lack of recovery disqualifies the cafe from relevance, the state could now answer, "We looked thoroughly, lawfully, and by the book." Negative searches also generate timing value. The destructive work was targeted to the period after the last verified sighting and before routine cleaning and maintenance could reasonably erase trace signals. Teams checked cleaning logs and supply orders to understand how often floors were stripped, drains flushed, and traps serviced. If maintenance cadence could have obliterated evidence, that is reported. It helps a judge contextualize why emptiness might be procedural rather than exculpatory. The broader point is that a negative can still move a homicide file forward. With no confirmed crime scene and no body, the case had two pillars left to build on: the silence of Dawn's life in the record and the statements that would later be played in court. This day of work fortified the first pillar by removing the easy attack lines. The state wouldn't be claiming an evidentiary treasure it couldn't show. The defense wouldn't be able to say the search never happened or was cosmetic. Everyone would be bound to the same truth. The cafe was the last known location. Investigators executed a destructive, supervised, and documented search, and they didn't recover remains. For the people who ate there, worked there, or passed by, seeing saw cuts in a familiar floor had an emotional cost. The humane approach is to state what the record states and nothing more. A workplace is not an exhibit. It is where people try to hold a normal life together. If a search is needed, the law owes that place precision and speed. The team finished what the warrant permitted, restored what had to be restored for safety, and cleared the scene. Owners received documentation of what was opened and why. That courtesy is not decoration, it's accountability. One more operational note deserves mention because it anticipates arguments that often follow. All recordings from this search, body-worn video if issued, stills, handler logs, sample forms, and entry-exit times were preserved in the same evidence system that holds interview recordings. When later hearings asked who authorized a specific cut or whether a dog's behavior constituted an alert, the answers would not come from memory. They would come from the record. What changed at the end of this day was subtle but important. The file no longer had to carry the weight of a hypothetical. If the cafe was involved, why didn't you search? It had the answer. The next step would shift away from concrete and drains and toward words, how they were collected, what was said, and how the law decides whether a statement is something a jury can trust. That's where this case was headed, because when buildings stay quiet, you measure what people say next. If you've stayed with us this far, consider one practical safeguard you can act on in your own world. Small businesses overwrite surveillance fast. If someone reliable in your circle doesn't show and the pattern truly breaks, ask nearby owners to preserve footage immediately. Evidence isn't just science, it's timing. The jump off the cliff forced the case into a clinical lane where every word would have to be earned. In the hospital, access came only after medical clearance and a rights advisement. Detectives did what the law requires: identify themselves on tape, mark the time, verify the patient's capacity to understand, and ask direct questions about the narrow window already fixed by the cafe's records. This was not a conversation about rumors. It was a custodial interview designed to withstand a courtroom fight over voluntariness. What emerged, in substance, was an account that acknowledged control and restraint, a struggle that ended with Dawn Vienne no longer responsive, and a description of post-incident handling that prosecutors would later characterize as disposal, using means available in a commercial kitchen over multiple days. The language in the recording is factual rather than graphic in this telling, because the point here is evidentiary weight, not shock. The hospital setting mattered. So did the chain of custody. The audio was duplicated, sealed, and logged. Everyone present was identified by name. Any medication administered to the patient was documented so a judge could later decide if the waiver of rights was valid. A statement like that is never enough by itself. Investigators looked for consistency across time and audience. Portions of the same story appeared later in conversations with people close to the subject, including admissions about restraint and the method of getting rid of remains. Those repetitions, captured in witness interviews and, in some instances, recorded communications, did not replace physical evidence. They acted like scaffolding around a case that still had no body and no confirmed crime scene. In California, a homicide can be proven without a recovered victim if the total picture is strong enough. This file was beginning to look like that kind of picture. Defense counsel knew where to attack. They questioned whether a person recovering from a fall and receiving medication could make a knowing, voluntary statement. They probed the timing of the interview, the exact words of the advisement, and whether pain management affected comprehension. They pointed to the lack of remains and the absence of a blood-identified scene as reasons to doubt any account that could not be tested against a lab report. Those are legitimate pressure points. The prosecution anticipated them by building a record that showed capacity, repeated admissions outside the hospital, and details in the statement that lined up with independent facts. time windows, access to equipment, and the timeline of the cafe searches that found nothing because, by the speaker's own words, there would be nothing to find. The legal standards are specific. A judge must decide, outside the jury's presence, whether the statement was voluntary, not coerced, and made with an understanding of rights. That hearing turns on paperwork and testimony, the nurse who noted alertness, the detective who read the warning, the audio that catches pauses and clarifications. If the judge rules the statement admissible, jurors later get to weigh credibility. They hear the recording. They compare it to other statements, to the timeline you've already heard, and to the conspicuous silence of Dawn's phone, banking, and medical life after October 2009. There is a narrow human point worth making. Families are often asked to live with two forms of absence at once: no remains to lay to rest, and a case that rests on words rather than a body. The ethical way to tell their story is to keep the record straight. Here, the record shows a sequence. A cliff event that created lawful access. A recorded statement with explicit admissions, separate confirmations of key details to other listeners, and a negative search that, instead of undermining the case, fit the logic of what the speaker described. The meaning of those pieces would be decided later by 12 people, but the mechanics were now in place. From an investigator's seat, the value of this chapter is that it shifts the burden from speculation to statements collected under conditions that the law recognizes. The cafe remains a last known location, not a proven crime scene. No body has been recovered. Those facts do not change here. What changes is that the case now has an internal explanation for why the physical record is thin. Jurors may accept it or reject it, but they will not be asked to guess how a disappearance with no body could still be prosecuted. They will be able to press play. One last practical note for anyone listening who runs a business or manages a household. Documentation is not a bureaucratic chore. It is the backbone of accountability. Accurate logs, timestamp systems, and preserved recordings protect the innocent and clarify the truth when it counts. In towns like Lomita and elsewhere, that kind of routine can make or break a case long before a jury ever hears it. A homicide trial without a body asks jurors to trust process over spectacle. Los Angeles County built this case the same way it was investigated. Clean timelines, recorded statements, and disciplined searches that showed diligence even when they produced nothing physical. The courtroom in 2012 was not a stage for theories. It was a place where each piece the jury would hear had a documented path from the real world to the exhibit table. Prosecutors opened with the spine you already know. Dawn Vians, last reliably seen in Lomita in October 2009, followed by a total stop in her phone, banking, prescriptions, and travel. They did not promise a weapon. They did not promise a crime scene. They promised a timeline and a set of words captured under lawful conditions. The jury heard how the cafe's closing routine fixed the final window, how surrounding canvases tightened the minutes, how the decision matrix closed off a voluntary departure, and how, after a cliffside flight and rescue in February 2011, a recorded hospital interview produced an account of restraint, a victim who became unresponsive, and disposal steps that matched access to a commercial kitchen. Each witness stayed in lane, detectives on process, handlers on what their dogs did and did not do, technicians on how audio files were collected and sealed, and civilians on what they were told later in unguarded moments. The defense took its shots where the law expects them. First, voluntariness. Was the interview in the hospital truly a knowing waiver, given medical treatment and pain? The court held a separate hearing on that issue, outside the jury's presence, walking through the rights advisement, the patient's alertness, and the chain of custody for the audio. The judge ruled the statement admissible, and the panel returned. Second, proof beyond words. Could an account that lacked a recovered body be trusted when negative searches found no remains at the cafe? The state answered that question by showing the warrant-backed cuts, the plumbing inspections, the grease trap checks, and the documented negative results. Clear proof of diligence rather than proof of absence alone. That transparency mattered. It told the jury this case would live or die on process, not on invented discovery. Jurors were instructed on second-degree murder, malice without premeditation, intent inferred from conduct, and the absence of lawful justification. The court also explained how circumstantial evidence can be as persuasive as direct evidence when it forms a consistent, reasonable whole. The instructions said nothing about punishing odd behavior. They focused on what the law recognizes. Motive is not required. A body is not required. The question is whether the evidence leaves you firmly convinced. The recording carried weight because it did not stand alone. Witnesses described hearing the same core facts at different times: restraint, death, and a method for getting rid of remains that aligned with the realities of a working kitchen. Those repetitions were important because they were not collected in a single custodial interview. They surfaced in separate contexts. The state tied them back to neutral anchors: the last seen interval at the cafe, the immediate and sustained silence in Dawn's digital and financial life, and the destructive search that logically produced no remains if the account in the recording was accurate. The prosecution never claimed to have found what the interview said had been destroyed. It claimed to have found a record that explained why nothing would be left to find. The defense urged restraint. Without a body and without a blood-identified scene, the state was asking the jury to sign off on a conclusion written on paper. They proposed alternate readings for the cliff event: panic, despair, anything but consciousness of guilt. They asked jurors to measure the hospital setting with skepticism. Those arguments were not dismissed. They were weighed against a framework that had been built carefully from 2009 to 2012. The risk for the defense was that each alternative needed a factual foothold: a text, a charge, a camera hit that never appeared. Deliberations were not endless. Jurors requested playback of the recorded statement and asked to review portions of the instructions on how to treat admissions and circumstantial evidence. They compared the words they heard with the tight window in which Dawn stopped appearing in the record. They looked at the negative search and asked whether it undercut the state or fit the narrative they had heard. In a nobody case, that is the sharpest question. Does the emptiness contradict the claim, or is the emptiness exactly what the claim predicts? Their answer arrived as a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. It was the legal recognition that malice could be inferred from conduct, the restraint that ended in an unresponsive victim, and that the absence of a recovered body did not block accountability when the entire record pointed in one direction. The case did not end with a flourish. It ended with a finding that closed the central question the investigation had been asking since October 2009. Dawn did not walk away. Trials do not heal families. They deliver findings. The humane thing to say in this moment is simple: a conviction brings legal closure. It does not replace a recovery. That distinction will matter in the next phase, when the court sets a sentence and the defense tries to claw back the most disturbing detail in the recorded account. For now, the jury's decision stands where the investigation led it: process over spectacle, and a verdict reached without a body. The verdict in 2012 settled the central question. Dawn Viennes did not walk away from her life in Lomita. The next phase was not about persuasion, it was about consequences. In March 2013, the court imposed the penalty the law reserves for second-degree murder in California: 15 years to life. The judgment tracked the evidence the jury had already credited: a tight last-seen window, a total stop to Dawn's digital and financial footprint after October 2009, a destructive but negative search that showed diligence rather than discovery, and recorded admissions collected under lawful conditions. The sentence made those findings durable. Post-trial, the defense moved to blunt the most disturbing detail in the recorded account, offering a walkback that challenged what jurors had heard. The court rejected the attempt. Admissibility had already been litigated. Credibility had already been weighed. The conviction stood. Appeals did not undo it. What remained for Dawn's family was what no courtroom can supply. No remains have been recovered. There is no gravesite to visit, no physical return to mark a final goodbye. In the years that followed, parole reviews surfaced as the only regular public checkpoints. Panels looked at accountability, insight, and risk. As of September 14, 2025, the outcome is unchanged. David Viennes remains convicted and incarcerated. Dawn has not been found. There is a quiet truth in this kind of case. Process is not a substitute for a person, but it is the best tool a community has when evidence is thin and time keeps moving. The investigation did its work without inventing a crime scene. The court respected the rules that keep statements reliable, and a jury reached a verdict without a body. That is not a cinematic ending. It is a lawful one. If there is a takeaway worth carrying past this story, it is practical and humane. Report disappearances early. Preserve the small records that become large later: camera clips, schedules, receipts, and keep saying the victim's name. Closure in the legal sense is not the same as peace. Families live with both truths at once. Looking back on Dawn's story, I can't help but remind myself and you that safety at home is never something to take for granted. What happened in Lomita shows how silence and hidden abuse can end in tragedy. My hope is that by telling these cases, we learn to recognize danger earlier, to protect those around us, and to value every voice before it's too late. Do you think justice without a body is ever enough, or does it always leave questions behind? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what struck you most. If this video moved you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.